A few years ago, I was working in a refugee camp in Rwanda as part of a United Nations mission. We were there to study the environmental conditions after the war. And a woman came up to me and she said, "Can I talk to you alone for a few minutes?" And I said, "Sure." And so we went off to the side. And she said to me, "Do you have children?" And I said, "Yes, I do. I have two daughters and a son." And she said, "That's great." She said, "I have something for you." She said, "I'm going to give you my daughter. I love her, but I can't take care of her anymore." She said, "I want you to raise her with your children. I want her to know that a better life than this is possible." Now, when you're part of a UN mission and you're working in a refugee camp, one thing you cannot do is take a child out of that safe haven. You have to focus on what you're there for, which is try to increase the stability so that the world she grows up in is a world that provides her with some chance for dignity, some opportunity for a better life. And that's not an easy thing. Wars today are very destructive. They may not be as big as the wars of the last century, but they do a lot of damage. Paul Collier, the British economist, estimates that the average war today costs about $64 billion. And they take place in countries where the gross domestic product is often just a fraction of that. Liberia, under 1 billion. Sierra Leone, under 2 billion. Roads are destroyed, energy grids, water systems. People are displaced. The educational system comes to a halt. The government is destroyed. Farms are left to fallow. Not only is the damage extensive, but wars today often take place in countries that already have a lot of problems, where there's extreme poverty and corrupt government, where there are population pressures. And so maybe it's not surprising that about half the time, efforts to stabilize countries as they come out of war fail, and the countries slide back into war within a few years. But we have to try to do what we can to improve the ratio, because there are millions of lives at stake, millions of futures at stake. About a decade ago, I was working in northern Pakistan, and I was looking at the links between environmental stress and violent conflict. And after that, I joined with 3 colleagues, and we produced a book called Conserving the Peace, and we made a very simple argument. We said that in many parts of the world, it was going to be very difficult to bring stability, to bring social change, if we didn't pay more attention to the environmental stresses in those places where livelihoods depend very directly on farmland and access to water and access to forest. Over 80% of the wars of the past 50 years have taken place in the environmentally most compromised parts of the planet. Subsequent to that book, some people at the United Nations contacted me and they asked if I would produce a case for integrating natural resource management into post-conflict operations. And so we worked and we produced a little document, and they invited me to New York to present it. And that was an exciting moment for me. It was a huge room like this one, tiers of people sitting beside their country flags, 200 flags, you look out there. And I talked about how natural resources can contribute to war, conflict over diamonds, conflict over water. I talked about all the ways in which war damages the environment. And I talked about how important natural resources are to the post-conflict period, to resettling people and getting them back to work. And when I was finished, representatives from some of the largest countries in the world offered their comments, and they said, "What is this guy doing here? We're about peace and security, and he's talking about natural resources. He's talking to the wrong group." And I realized at that moment that they were so protective of their borders that they weren't even willing to listen to what I was saying. And I thought, it's over, right here. And then something really remarkable happened. A representative from a conflict-ridden country stood up and he said, "What you have just heard is what we experience. And we have to take this seriously. If institutional boundaries compel us in a direction which doesn't succeed, which is likely to fail, then we have to change things." You know, we always hear about how important it is to believe in yourself, and I fully agree with that. But there's something else which is just as important and just as empowering, and that's when other people believe in you. And that's what I felt at that moment. And when the dust settled, the United Nations said, okay, we're going to try this. And they asked if I would go on the first mission to do this, and eventually to lead that mission in Sierra Leone. And we went into the country and we assessed the situation. We came up with a work plan. And the plan was approved, and it's being implemented. And now people look at that model and they say, well, obviously you have to do that. And in some small way, I think we've nudged 7 million people closer to lives of real dignity and real opportunity. Now, over the years, I've had the chance to work in the Congo and Rwanda, Sierra Leone, in Pakistan, in Nepal, Cambodia, in a lot of the world's hot spots. And I have a couple further observations I would like to share with you. When a war ends, when a disaster takes place, the world often rallies around, and they offer a lot of support. Before that place can really effectively absorb and use it. And then after a couple of years, we get disappointed and we say, enough, we're out of here. You guys aren't using the support effectively. And we have to change how we think. We have to smooth out that process. We can't change a country at breakneck speed in 2 or 3 years. That's a 10-year period we have to be committed to. And we have to bulk up the process as well. Today, every year we spend over $1.8 trillion on war and military, and I am a strong believer in national security and in the need to use force at times. But we spend less than 7% of that amount on peace and development, and we spread that over 150 countries. And that ratio, that equation, it just doesn't make sense. We need to shift the border just a little bit, and we'll have some remarkable results. The second thing I think we have to work on a bit is our attitude. Like a lot of people, I'm sure, my first exposure to Africa was reading Tarzan and Joseph Conrad. This is a scary place. Jungle and desert. Corrupt colonialists, corrupt political leaders, tribal rivalries. It might have been the cradle of civilization at one point in its history, but today it was just a bunch of small, angry, disorganized countries with big problems and a bleak future. And that's an attitude which it's easy to understand, it's easy to share, it's easy to reinforce. Really easy to reinforce. I was working in flood camps in Rwanda, and too far from the capital to go back at the end of the day. So I went into a small guest house. There's a kid behind the counter, he's about 11 years old, and I said, do you have a room? He said, yeah, $5. So I said, I'll take it. And we're walking over to the room. He said, you know, that room is very small. I said, that's okay, I'm only here at night. He said, well, there's a hole in the wall. I said, okay, I got some duct tape. I can cover that hole. And he said, there are a lot of bugs in that room. And by the next morning, I was ready to leave Africa forever. Because there were a lot of bugs in that room. We created this big wall of words around a whole continent that show all of its problems. But what they hide is the courage and the resilience and the ingenuity of the people living behind that wall. And having been exposed to that, I know that even the worst off countries in the world can change, and they have. Look at Ghana, look at South Korea. It's possible, and we can support that process. We can hasten that process. Today we have unbelievable, unprecedented tools at our disposal. With wireless, with the internet, we can get a bird's eye view of a situation. We can share information. We can bring the world's brain power to bear on problems anywhere in the world at any time. We can do truly remarkable things. A friend of mine a few years ago lost both his legs in a landmine accident in Somalia. And when he came back, he joined the emerging movement to ban landmines. And at the very start of that movement, that campaign, he was told, this is a nice idea, but it's never going to happen. It is never going to happen. Nobody gives up a weapon that's useful. 3 years later, and they used information technology so effectively, 3 years later, 3/4 of the world signed a treaty to ban landmines forever. Remarkable change is truly possible. And there's a group of people emerging who understand those tools. And they understand that when you have tools that are so powerful, with that sort of capacity comes responsibility, moral responsibility, to make the world a better place. And that it's in our interest to do this. It's in our interest to grow people out of the conditions that foster terrorism and extremism and infectious disease and crisis. Social entrepreneurs, people willing to combine their passion to make a better world with sound business tools, are developing truly innovative ways of taking daunting social problems and making them less daunting, making them manageable. I teach a course on social enterprise. And every day, it reaffirms my belief in the 21st century because I see the vitality and the creativity of the next generation of leaders. These days, there's a lot of people, and they look out at the world and they say, economic crisis, population growth, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, climate change. This is the century in which humankind finally throws itself off a cliff. That's what you've got to look forward to. And that's not at all what I see. We're climbing a mountain. We've done that before. Humankind is pretty good at beating the odds. We're facing a steep pitch right now, but we've got big tools and we can make it up. And when we get there, I have absolutely no doubt at all that we'll be dazzled by the view from the top. Thank you.